Hey everybody, welcome to another edition of Tony T's Tune Talk, available here at the Port Washington Public Library's YouTube channel. I'm your host, Tony Traguardo, and I'm ready to talk tunes. So, let's imagine that I'm the leader of a band, or maybe I'm the group's main songwriter. And maybe I get disappointed when my songs are recorded because my bandmates never play the songs exactly the way I hear them in my head when I write them. Or maybe I just love to write songs. I have fun playing or trying to play a dozen different instruments. And I don't want to work within anyone else's time schedule, not even other band members. I might simply be on a tight budget. Who knows? For these reasons and many more, many great artists of the rock and roll era have recorded albums all by themselves. On today's episode, let's look at a few of them. Tubular Bells is the debut studio album by English multi-instrumentalist, composer, and songwriter Mike Oldfield. The album was released on May 25, 1973, as the first album on Richard Branson's Virgin Records. Oldfield, who was 19 years old when it was recorded, played almost all of the instruments on the mostly instrumental album. Mike Oldfield had learned to play the guitar at an early age, and he was playing in folk clubs with school friends by the age of 12 or 13. To escape from family domestic problems, Oldfield spent hours in his room practicing the guitar and composing instrumental pieces, eventually becoming an accomplished player. While recording an album at Abbey Road Studios as a member of the group Whole Wide World in 1970, the 17-year-old Oldfield became fascinated by the variety of instruments available in the studio. He would arrive there early and spend hours every morning experimenting with and learning to play the piano, the harpsichord, the mellotron, and various percussion instruments. After Whole Wide World broke up in mid-1971, Oldfield recorded demos of 4 tracks that he'd been composing in his head for some years. Using a modified tape recorder, he captured his guitar and bass, some toy percussion instruments, and a borrowed Farfisa organ. This primary piece was to be called Opus 1. While doing some session work later that year, Oldfield met the young entrepreneur Richard Branson, who had recently taken ownership of the Manor Studio in Oxfordshire, a facility being run by the music production team of Tom Newman and Simon Hayworth. Even though Oldfield was a shy and socially awkward fellow, he struck up a friendship with the two producers after they heard his guitar playing. Oldfield asked Newman to listen to his demos, and upon hearing them, Newman promised Oldfield that he would speak to Branson about them. Oldfield spent time in 1972 trying to get a number of record labels interested in his demos, but there were rejections all around. They all agreed that the piece was unmarketable without vocals. Oldfield was short on money and about to give up when he was invited to dinner with Richard Branson on Branson's houseboat. Over dinner, Branson told Oldfield that he liked the demo, and he invited Oldfield to come to the Manor and spend a week there recording Opus 1. To record Opus 1 in November of 1972, Oldfield requested the rental of various guitars, keyboards, and percussion instruments. The musician has recounted differing stories over the years regarding the inclusion of the Tubular Bells, alternately saying that they were among the instruments that he had asked Branson to rent, or that he saw them among instruments being removed from the studio after another musician had finished recording there, and he asked them to be left behind for his sessions. Oldfield ultimately played the majority of the instruments on Opus 1 by overdubbing, an uncommon recording technique at the time. In total, 274 musical overdubs were made by Oldfield during the recording. Vivian Stanchel, a former member of the comedy rock group the Bonzo Dog Doodah Band, was due to use the Manor after Oldfield, but he arrived while Opus 1 was being recorded. Oldfield was a fan of the way Stanchel had introduced the instruments one at a time on a Bonzo song called The Intro and the Outro. The shy Oldfield had to be persuaded by his producer Tom Newman to go and ask Stanchel if he would be willing to do the same on Opus 1. The adventurous Stanchel readily agreed to be the master of ceremonies on the record. And it was the way that Stanchel said, "plus Tubular Bells," to introduce the last instrument in the finale that gave Mike Oldfield the idea to call the complete album Tubular Bells. After part 1 of Tubular Bells, Opus 1, had been recorded, Oldfield returned to the Manor to record the second part of the planned album. One small portion of that second part features the sole outside musician, Steve Broughton of the Edgar Broughton Band, who plays a drum kit which Oldfield says made the segment sound fairly normal. Richard Branson pitched the completed piece to various music companies with the same lack of success that Oldfield had had. So plans were set in motion for Branson to set up his own record label with his partner Simon Draper and to make Tubular Bells its first release. The completed album entered the charts at a low-key number 31, but it soon started an extraordinary run that saw it consistently among the best sellers for months and months to come. Now, some iconic music and film moments result from happy accidents, and that's the case with part 1 of Tubular Bells landing placement in the 1973 horror classic The Exorcist. Now, as the story goes, director William Friedkin scrapped the original score by Lalo Schifrin of Mission Impossible fame and was on the hunt for replacement music. Friedkin was visiting the offices of Amit Ertegun, the president of Atlantic Records, who were the distributors of Tubular Bells in the United States, and he grabbed a promo copy of the album. As soon as he dropped the needle on his record player, Friedkin was convinced he had found the music that would be perfect for a supernatural horror flick. Most music is in 4/4 time, Oldfield said, but that curious little figure at the beginning is in 15/8. It's like a puzzle with a little bit missing. That's why it sticks in the brain. And that's why it worked so well as the soundtrack to The Exorcist. With that little bit missing, everything is not quite right. The huge surge in sales of Tubular Bells increased Mike Oldfield's profile and played an important part in the growth of the Virgin record label. Tubular Bells stayed in the top 10 UK album chart for 1 year beginning in March of 1974, during which it reached the #1 spot for a week. It has sold an estimated 15 million copies worldwide. And in a tip of the hat to Tubular Bells' significance to his empire, Branson named one of his first Virgin America aircrafts the Tubular Bell. He said, "I doubt any of that would have happened without Tubular Bells. I've listened to it so much, my wife won't let me play it anymore." Interesting bit of related trivia. In 2014, Mike Oldfield confessed to The Guardian that he didn't actually see The Exorcist until a decade after it was released. It's okay, Mike. We'll let it slide. By the time the smash hit album Ark of a Diver was released on December 31st of 1980, Steve Winwood had become more famous than he was relevant. Winwood became a rock star at the age of 16 with the Spencer Davis Group in the mid-60s. He went on to form Traffic in 1967, and then the supergroup Blind Faith with Eric Clapton and Ginger Baker in 1969. Along the way, every one of his Davis Group albums reached the UK top 10. Blind Faith's lone release quickly sold 1 million copies, and Traffic scored 3 gold albums and a platinum disc with 1974's When the Eagle Flies. But when Winwood went solo after Traffic, his fortune seemed to turn for the worst. He struggled to find a new direction. An initial stab at solo work, 1977's introspective Steve Winwood, went to number 22 in the US, but it failed to chart at all anywhere else in the world. Well, who could have guessed that he would emerge 3 years later with Ark of a Diver? With sales propelled by a top 10 hit, the soaring and seemingly autobiographical While You See a Chance, the album sold 1 million copies and saved Winwood's flagging career. It came at a pretty good time for me, Winwood told the Chicago Tribune, because had that not been successful, I'd have to think very carefully about what I was doing. I wouldn't have given up my musical career, but I would have thought about going into production rather than pursuing a career as a recording artist myself. A move to the countryside of Gloucester, some 60 miles northwest of London, provided plenty of cover for Winwood as he tried to make his way. I'd had enough of this album tour thing, Winwood told Rolling Stone. It was like I was on a treadmill and there was no way of getting off. I just had to say, that's it with traffic. No way can I do that anymore. Winwood had appeared on the occasional recording session with the likes of George Harrison and Marianne Faithfull, but otherwise he lived a hermit's life inside his farmhouse. Only his closest friends knew that he was actually busy recording. And unlike his 1977 self-titled effort, which featured some well-known former bandmates and studio aces, this time he was doing it completely alone. That meant converting a studio space and then laying down all of the tracks, a process that took most of 3 years between the two albums. Basically, he told the Associated Press in 1981, I thought it was going to be cheap, easy, and quick, and it was expensive, hard, and slow, as it turned out. I didn't really quite expect that. He christened his studio Netherturkdonic. Winwood had taken to carrying a microcassette on his countryside rambles to record his musical brainwaves. Furthermore, he had relearned to write the music out. Quote, so I may not be so much a slave to the tape machine, which I always have been. So, armed with detailed demos, music with no lyrics, and nebulous ideas computing in his brain, he became sufficiently schooled in Netherturkdonic's sonic possibilities. He disciplined himself like any self-employed worker. A strict timetable, 8 hours a day, 6 days a week. From my point of view, the situation's simple, he said. When you want to get something done, then you really must cut yourself off from everyone else. Wasn't quite everyone. He had the assistance of John Clark, a fine engineer who Winwood had been friends with since grammar school. Winwood's recording methods involved building up instrumental layers using a metronome or a click track. Drums would be added last when the rhythm had already been well invested into the number. While I was doing this record, because there was really so much involved with doing the different parts, I found that if I got bogged down with a particular aspect, maybe the vocal on one track, there was always so much to be done that I could leave that and spend a week on something else. I found I would go back to that other piece and say, of course, that's exactly what to do. By mid-September, Ark of a Diver was complete. While too late to catch the Christmas sell-in period, it was out by the final week of 1980, in the hopes that Santa Claus's record tokens would not have been wasted yet on something else. Winwood was actually smart to have waited. His DIY approach meant that he was relying more than ever on the emerging keyboard technology of the day. The lengthy recording process actually synchronized the release of Winwood's album perfectly with the growing popularity of synthesizer-based new wave music, which had begun at the tail end of the decade. It was like that previous era of struggle had never happened. But Winwood told the real story to People magazine in 1982. Because Ark was successful, it gives the impression that I've been cruising along nicely since 1967. That's an illusion. I strove through the 70s to get my head above water. It was a make-or-break situation. If it hadn't been for Ark of a Diver, I might have been a cab driver. The legendary Creedence Clearwater revival broke up in 1972. The group's leader and hit-making chief songwriter, the multi-instrumentalist John Fogerty, launched his solo career with the country-flavored album The Blue Ridge Rangers in 1973. Through the use of overdubbing different tracks during the recording process, he played all of the instruments and sang all of the vocals himself. Fogerty's efforts were rewarded with borderline hit status for the album single Hearts of Stone. He released his self-titled follow-up in 1975. Once again, Fogerty played every note on the album, which included the songs Rockin' All Over the World, a 1977 hit for Status Quo, and Almost Saturday Night, a hit for Dave Edmunds. John Fogerty's self-recorded fourth solo LP, Centerfield, was released on January 16, 1985, roughly a decade after his last album of new material. And as happy as fans were to hear from him, everyone wanted to know the same thing. Where had he been? Well, as with anything that takes 10 years, Fogerty's hiatus was due to a number of things, the first of which was the rejection in 1976 of what was supposed to have been his fourth solo outing, a record titled Hoodoo. Instead of leaning on him to deliver something better, Elektra Records chief Joe Smith told Fogerty, "Take your time. Come back when you're ready." A stunning turn of events for a performer who had always felt pressure, both internal and from his record label, to churn out hit products on a regular basis. That was the greatest thing that ever happened, Fogerty said in 1985, acknowledging that Smith's gentle rejection helped him get past what he deemed to be a lot of problems. As he put it, "The first thing I decided was I could take the time to have taste again. You know, the way it was before, when nothing came out until it was ready." Meanwhile, Fogerty found himself embroiled in a nasty, drawn-out legal war over Creedence Clearwater's legacy and the disbursement of contested royalties. A parade of lawyers and divided royalties that he admitted sent him spiraling into a terrible case of writer's block. Now, though he ended up spending untold hours practicing in the studio, time that he said helped to shape his chops considerably, he wasn't sure where all that work would ever lead him. It was getting worse. I was more and more depressed and further away from the center of John Fogerty. I could play, but I didn't know what to play. A blind man in a fog, just flitting around. The song that ultimately broke John Fogerty's dry streak was I Saw It on TV, a track that became the cornerstone of the album Centerfield. Recalling that he'd thought about this song for 3 or 4 years, with just a verse and a smattering of a melody, he traced its watershed moment to a fishing trip that left him with a day of nothing but drifting and thinking on his hands. I quit at about 6 o'clock in the evening, and I walked back to the car with maybe a verse and a half and a chorus. I was starting to feel a little confident, and I got my fishing gear straight, shut the door in the car, and click! My brain said, "Hey, I could do this." It felt like before, when I'd give myself that certain space and write Proud Mary, or whatever, he continued. I jumped over the hurdle. I was a songwriter again. It was a great moment for me. With I Saw It on TV under his belt, Fogerty was back in business as a songwriter. But that didn't mean he was back to cranking out classics at the same speed that he had during his Creedence Clearwater Revival glory days. The album that would eventually become Centerfield came together slowly, partly due to Fogerty's commitment to detail, and partly because he simply wasn't sure what he should sound like anymore. After toying with various approaches, he shed the synthesizer and the other sounds of the day, and he made his way back to where he'd started. As a result, Centerfield sounds a lot like a Creedence record. It actually served as a sign that after years of struggling to put it behind him, one of rock's greatest songwriters was starting to come to terms with his own past. It was a slow process. Now, Fogerty knew it sounded like Creedence, but he was unsure whether or not his new label, Warner Brothers, thought they were getting Michael Jackson or some modern synth rock guy. Fogerty later admitted, "I had to find out if I was working on the right thing. It was like in The Shining, when you think the guy is working on a book, but all he's been doing is typing this same line over and over. I thought maybe I was out there somewhere lost." His label's enthusiasm for the new album bolstered John Fogerty's confidence slightly, but the public's response to Centerfield took him the rest of the way. A hit beyond anyone's wildest expectations, the album rose all the way to number 1 on the Billboard album charts, and it sent the lead-off single, The Old Man Down the Road, to number 10 on the Hot 100. A follow-up, Rock and Roll Girls, hit number 20, and the title track became a number 4 rock hit, stalling just outside of Pop's Top 40. Well, there are a number of other musicians and songwriters who have managed to do it all by themselves on albums over the years, But that's about all we have time to talk about on this episode of Tony T's Tune Talk. Please visit the website and check out the other episodes. And, of course, visit Hoopla, where you're able to find a lot of the music that gets talked about on the episodes and all of the music that was discussed today. Thanks for watching, and happy listening.